At this time, we are going to show the video on Esther, but before we do that, I wanted to say one thing about it. Okay, when you get in the middle of the video, this jumped out at me. When they talk about Haman being hung on the gallows, they don't have him actually being hung on the gallows how I've always pictured it. They actually have him being impaled on a stake. And so I was thinking about that because I was like, that's the Bible says he was hung on a gallows. And so I looked it up and I was researching that. And actually the word gallows can mean a tree, a pole, a stick. And so it's definitely not what probably comes to your mind when you think of a very nicely well-built wooden set of gallows with a floor that falls out and a person that goes down through it, like we've seen in like maybe the 1800s in the Wild West movies, okay? It's definitely not that for sure. And actually, even through what I was reading, I came across the fact that there's a Greek historian, Herodotus, who in his work, The Histories, regularly presents impalement as a form of Persian punishment. And so Esther was part of the Persian Empire at that time, and that's really what they did. They didn't hang. And technically, not trying to gross anybody out at church on a Wednesday night, but technically, hanging was a form of, a cruel form of torture and death. And it doesn't have to be just hanging with a noose like we would think about. I mean, if he's impaled, he's technically hanging on some gallows. And so, anyway, I just wanted to point that out because I know that jumped out to me, and I was like, that just doesn't sound right. But upon further research, that is a definite possibility. I don't think anybody can concretely say, but I'll throw that out. All right, this time, with that introduction to the book of Esther, go ahead and play the video.
The book of Esther. It's one of the more exciting and curious books in the Bible. The story is set over 100 years after the Babylonian exile of the Israelites from their land. And while some Jews did return to Jerusalem, remember Ezra and Nehemiah, many did not. And so the book of Esther is about a Jewish community living in Susa, the capital city of the ancient Persian Empire. The main characters in this story are two Jews, Mordecai and then his niece Esther. And then there's the king of Persia, who's something of a drunken pushover in this story. And then there's the Persian official Haman, the cunning villain. Now this is a curious book in the Bible, mainly for the fact that God is never even mentioned, not once. Which might strike you as kind of odd. I mean, isn't the Bible about God? But this is a brilliant technique by the author, who's anonymous, by the way. It's an invitation to read this story looking for God's activity, and there are signs of it everywhere. The story is full of very odd, quote, coincidences and ironic reversals, and it all forces you to see God's purpose at work, but behind the scenes. Let's just dive into the story. The book opens with the king of Persia throwing two elaborate banquet feasts that last a total of 187 days, and it's all for the grandiose purpose of displaying his greatness and splendor. On the last day of the banquet feast, he's really drunk, and he demands that his wife, Queen Vashti, appear at the party to show off her beauty. She refuses, and so in a drunken rage, the king deposes Vashti and makes the silly decree that all Persian men should now be the masters of their own homes. Then he holds a beauty pageant because he wants to find a new queen. This is like a really bad soap opera. But it's right here that we're introduced to Esther and Mordecai. Esther hides her Jewish identity and enters the beauty pageant and wins. And the king is so obsessed with Esther that he elevates her to become the new queen of Persia. Now after this, and even more serendipitous, is the fact that Mordecai just happens to overhear two royal guards plotting to murder the king. And so he informs Esther, who in turn informs the king, and Mordecai gets credit for saving the king's life. Now right here from the beginning, God's not mentioned anywhere, but this all seems providentially ordered. What is it that God's up to? You have to keep reading. We're next introduced to Haman, who's not actually a Persian. He's called an Agagite. He's a descendant of the ancient Canaanites. Remember 1 Samuel chapter 15. The king elevates Haman to the highest position in the kingdom, and he demands that everybody kneel before Haman. Well, when Mordecai sees Haman, he refuses to kneel, which of course fills Haman with rage. And when he finds out that Mordecai's Jewish, Haman successfully persuades the king to enact this crazy decree to destroy all of the Jewish people. And to decide the date of the Jews' annihilation, Haman rolls the dice. A die is called pur in Hebrew. Tuck that away for later. 11 months later, on the 13th of Adar, all the Jews will die. Haman and the king then have a drinking banquet to celebrate their really horrible decision. So the focus now turns to Mordecai and Esther, who are the only hope for the Jewish people. They make a plan that Esther's going to reveal her Jewish identity to the king and ask him to reverse the decree. But approaching the king without a royal request is, according to Persian law, an act worthy of death. So in a key statement, Mordecai, he's confident that even if Esther remains silent, that deliverance for the Jews will arrive from another place. And then Mordecai wonders aloud. He says, who knows? Maybe you've become queen for this very moment. Esther responds with bravery, and she purposes to go to the king with her amazing words, if I perish, I perish. Now, in what unfolds, we watch the ironic reversal of all of Haman's evil plans. So Esther hosts the king and Haman at a first banquet, and she says that she wants to make a special request of both of them at an exclusive banquet the following day. So Haman leaves the banquet totally drunk, and he sees Mordecai in the street. He fumes with anger, and he orders that a tall stake be built so that Mordecai can be impaled upon it in the morning. It seems like things can't get any worse for the Jews and for Mordecai. But all of a sudden, the story pivots. It just so happens that night, the king, he can't sleep, and he has the royal chronicles read to him for good bedtime reading, and he just happens to hear about how Mordecai had saved the king's life. He had totally forgotten. So in the morning, Haman enters to request Mordecai's execution, and the king in that moment orders Haman to honor Mordecai publicly for saving his life. So now Haman has to lead Mordecai around the city on a royal horse, telling everyone to praise him. Now this moment in the story, it's a pivot for the whole book. It begins Haman's downfall and Mordecai's rise to power. Watch how this works. The day after is Esther's second banquet. So the king and Haman arrive, and Esther informs the king that first of all she's Jewish, and second that Haman has enacted a decree to murder her and to murder Mordecai, who saved his life, and to murder all of the Jews. Now the king's had a lot to drink, so when he hears this news, he goes into yet one more drunken rage, and he orders that Haman be impaled on the very stake he made for Mordecai. It's ironic and a grisly way for Haman to go. Haman's execution, however, doesn't solve the problem of the decree to kill all of the Jews. So the focus now turns to Esther and Mordecai as they make a plan to reverse the decree. They discover that the king can't revoke a decree that he's already made. So instead, the king commissions Mordecai to issue a counter-decree. On the appointed day that all of the Jews were supposed to be killed, the 13th of Adar, now the Jews are ordered to defend themselves and to destroy any who plotted to kill them. Then Mordecai, Esther, and Jews everywhere hold banquets and feasts to celebrate this new decree, and Mordecai is elevated to a seat beside the king. Eventually, the decreed day comes, and the Jews triumph over their enemies. First, they destroy Haman's family, and then any other Persian officials who had joined in Haman's plot. And then on a second day, they get permission to destroy any who plotted against them throughout the entire kingdom. This results in joy and celebration as the Jews are rescued from annihilation. The story then tells about how Esther and Mordecai established by decree this annual 2-day feast of Purim to commemorate their deliverance from destruction. And the name of the feast comes from Haman's dice. Remember, Purim. The book concludes with a short epilogue as Mordecai is elevated to second in command in the kingdom, and we are told now of his royal greatness and splendor as the Jews thrive in exile. Now, step back. Notice how this whole story has been designed. The story was full of moments of ironic reversal, but we can now see the whole story is structured as an ironic reversal, right down to the details. So the king's splendor and feasts and decrees are mirrored by Mordecai's splendor and feasts and decrees at the end. Esther and Mordecai, they first saved the king, but now in the end they save all of the Jews. Then you have Haman's elevation and edicts and banquet that gets reversed by Mordecai's elevation and edict and banquet. And then at the center you have Esther and Mordecai's planning scenes, and then Esther's 2 banquets that act as a frame around the greatest moment of reversal in the whole story, Haman's humiliation and Mordecai's exaltation. beautiful. Another fascinating feature of this book is the moral ambiguity of the characters. There's a lot of drinking and anger and sex and murder, of which Mordecai and Esther are a part. Not to mention their violation of many commands in the Torah, like marrying Gentiles or eating impure foods. And so the story's not putting Mordecai and Esther forward as moral examples, as if it endorses all of their behavior. But they are put forward as models of trust and hope when things get really bad. And so the book of Esther comes back to that question with which we began: why God is not mentioned. The message of this book seems to be that when God seems absent, when his people are in exile, when they're unfaithful to the Torah, does this mean that God is done with Israel? Has God abandoned his promises? And the book of Esther says no. It invites us to see that God can and does work in the real mess and moral ambiguity of human history, and he uses the faithfulness of even morally compromised people to accomplish his purposes. And so the book of Esther asks us to be willing to trust God's providence even when we can't see it working, and to hope that no matter how bad things get, God is committed to redeeming his world. And that's what the book of Esther is all about.
That's pretty good stuff. There's two stories in the Bible I never, ever get tired of reading. One of them is the story of Joseph. I mean, that's just the way that climax and ends. It's unbelievable. And then Esther, I mean, I grin every single time I think about, and the phrase that I love through that whole story is, it just so happens, right? It just so happens on the day that Haman's going to go to the king, the night before, the king can't sleep at all. And he goes and he pulls out the history books and he realizes that Mordecai saved his life. And as Haman comes running in there to tell him that he wants Mordecai dead, he says, hey, what should I do to honor this person? And Haman lays it out. The irony in the story is so great because Haman tells him, I think you should put your ring on him. I think you should put your clothes on him. I think you should lead him out in the streets on your horse. And I think you should take your most trusted servant and have him be the one that does all of that. And he's like, Haman, go get Mordecai and do all of that to him. And I mean, you think about the reversal there. That's just, it's awesome. The Bible has got some incredible things in it. All right, I want to deal with tonight the two things that stuck out to me. One of them is why God was not mentioned. So be thinking about that because that's going to be the second question that I ask you. But here's the first question that I want to ask you is this. What is Esther a hero of the faith? Yes or no? How many say yes? How many say no? How many of you have no idea now that you watched that video? All right, you said no. Go ahead. I'm kind of curious why you think that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting that she doesn't take any action until all of a sudden her life is on the line. Mordecai says, hey, don't you think that just because you're the queen, you're going to be able to escape all this? When they find out that you're a Jew, that's it. Now, I have to be honest. Like this is something this is what I've been learning through these videos, that we really, when we read the Bible, we have to think really about what we're reading and not just go through the motions and think deeply on these stories. And it's challenging me personally because honestly, until today, I never had thought of anything but Esther as a hero of the faith. I mean, she went in, who knows, God brought us to the kingdom for such a time as this, and I just saw her praying and fasting and begging God that his name would be glorified through all this, but that's nowhere mentioned in the entire book of Esther. And upon what Mrs. Gray was saying as she read through it and found all those things to be curious, was Esther right or wrong for marrying the king? Wrong. I mean, God forbid them from marrying Gentiles, forbid them from, what's that? Okay, see, now this is good because this is where the moral ambiguity comes in. She says, did she have an option considering the circumstances? You know what that word ambiguity means? It's open to more than one interpretation. So, so this is good. Go ahead. I think Mordecai, I did not read through the whole book, but if I'm not mistaken, I believe that Mordecai. Okay. It was a decree that was sent to all the virgins in all 167 provinces that he had, which was a huge kingdom. Okay, so there's no doubt about that. So yeah, these are the hard, difficult questions of life that come up. And you know, I was pondering on this today. I do believe that I was thinking about it from this perspective. Would I have wanted my daughter to marry King Ahasuerus? And I can emphatically say, no way, man, that guy was a drunkard. I mean, do you want to just be one of the harem? I mean, one of, what's that? Bringing up some good points there. You're exactly right. Her parents were dead. So, you know, what was she supposed to do? Now, here's one thing. And let me just say this, by the way, because I was going to leading into all of this. We can sit here and we can talk about Esther and we can talk about the things that are right and wrong. But let's just remember this. The story is never about human beings. The story is never about me and my faults and my failures. Now, there's lessons that we can learn from each other. There's lessons that we can certainly learn from Esther and different things like that. The story is not about us, though. The story is completely 100% about God. And that's what's so amazing about this story to me is even when it seems dark and even when you're in the midst of a corrupt, horrible, wicked, pagan empire, which is what the Persian Empire was, God's still moving and working behind the scenes, and he's doing things that can only be attributed to him. And I have no doubt in my mind that Esther was appointed to the kingdom for such a time as this, that God guided and directed every one of those decisions and every step that she took, and she was put in that position for the exact reason of saving his people alive. And so my encouragement right off the bat is, and there's a lot, here's some interesting things though, just to go back on that. Daniel, Ezra, and Nehemiah were all her contemporaries, okay? Daniel was not afraid of his faith. He prayed openly before the Lord for 70 years. He had 3 different kings that he served under, and every single one of them knew that his faith was strong in God. Ezra had a passion for God's word, okay? That was, Nehemiah had a passion and a longing to go back to his city, Jerusalem. You don't necessarily see those things in Esther's life. Now, the counter to that is, again, the story is not about Esther. The story is about God. They're focusing on specific details, and so we really don't know one way or another where the heart is. But no matter what, we do know this. It's complex, and it's some difficult situations, and that's where we left off last week at the end of the book of Ezra. All right, go ahead. That's right. Yes, he works in spite of what we do. And praying for that decision to go through, yes, because their lives were at stake because of all of that. You're exactly right. And so I find it to be extremely interesting, just again, though, how, that's where I just wanted to say that. Remember at the end of Ezra, or Nehemiah was going through and he was commanding the divorce and the different things to happen. And I was thinking about, just again, like the moral ambiguity. Aaron Shipe, who Mrs. Johnson already mentioned, who was here on Sunday night, we were talking, and he was just mentioning about how marriage is in Tanzania, where they're at. Number one, when you sign up for your marriage license, you check either monogamous or open to polygamy. Those are the options right there. One wife or open to polygamy. That's actually on your, so even if you don't have multiple wives, if you check that box open, you have the freedom to go ahead and get married to multiple wives. So I asked him, I said, do you have anybody in your church that's been saved that has multiple wives? And then what are you going to do? You're going to tell him to pick his favorite one and to divorce all the rest? And he said he hasn't had that specifically in his church, but he has counseled in other churches in that country that if you do get saved and you have committed yourself to those 4 or 5 or however many women that you've married, it's your responsibility at that point to take care of them. Now, we all know that's less than God's best, but what do you do in situations like that? And that's the point that I want us to see. Again, in spite of our problems, our mistakes, our faults, our failures, God is moving and working, and he still can get glory out of your life. He still can use your life. You never reach a point where it's too dark, it's too complicated for him to be able to step in and work and do some amazing things. And so I just find the mercy of God to be far deeper and richer than we can even fully comprehend and fathom. And so let's never lose sight of that. Let's revel in who God is and in his mercy. And so I really enjoyed that. That was good because that's what he's talking about. That's the moral ambiguity. That's what that's in reference to. And we could sit here and go back and forth on that for a long time. Here's my other question that we'll talk about tonight. Why is God not mentioned? Why is God not mentioned in the book of Esther? Go ahead, Bob. Okay, so do you think that there's something, though, a lesson that he's trying to get across just in that? Okay, he'll never abandon you. There's no doubt about it. But what about, do you think that we need to just really examine how sometimes God, not sometimes, but how God does move and work? Yes, and even when we don't recognize it or necessarily see it, and that's really, that's the purpose of this whole, nothing happens by chance, nothing happens by accident. God is in control of every single situation. Pure, for instance, that word that you saw in there, the rolling of the die, that's been something that's jumped out to me because I've been studying for my message on Sunday in Jonah, and guess what they did in chapter 1 to determine who was the guilty person? They rolled the die. That's exactly right. And guess who the lot fell on? Jonah. Coincidence, right? I mean, come on. These things are just superstitious and the things of luck and chance, right? Absolutely not. God guides and directs in every circumstance. I've been asked these questions before. Sometimes I think we can just think that God governs the big pictures of life, but he really does care intimately about every single detail of your life personally. That's how big our God is. And he's behind every circumstance and every event and everything that happens and takes place in life. And so it is a brilliant way to write the book of Esther because in all of these things that you think are just happening by chance, you go all the way back to even, I read this afternoon, this was so good. When the children of Israel are leaving Egypt, okay, and the 10 plagues, it's undeniable that God is the one orchestrating those 10 plagues. And at the beginning of Esther chapter 1, you know what you have? You have a king that's getting drunk out of his mind who's going to bring his queen to put on public display really in a disgusting, I mean, what is he thinking as a man? You're going to put your wife on display like that in front of a bunch of drunken men. I mean, you can just imagine how bad that whole situation was. And guess who was just as much at work in every one of those details as he was when the children of Israel were leaving Egypt in the promised land? God was. But you know what we tend to do sometimes? We tend to think, oh, that's just a coincidence that happened and took place in my life, and that's not God. That's not true. There's no coincidences. God is in control. He's in control of the roll of the dice. He's in control of the lots. He's in control of everything that happens and that takes place in our life, and you can see that as you go through that story, because again, it just so happened that he divorced Vashti. It just so happened that here is this Jewish orphan, and he sends out a decree to all the virgins in 167 provinces throughout the community. It just so happens that he chooses this poor little orphan girl who was just right down the street from the palace, right? All of this is coincidence. And then it just so happens that Mordecai uncovers a plot to save the king's life. You have to understand, too, things that happened 10, 15 years ago in your life, God's setting that up for something that might not come to fruition for another 20 or 30 years. He's behind everything that happens, and he can use it for his honor and for his glory no matter what takes place. And so that's why God's not mentioned. That's what I see, that it's a clear picture of how the providence of God works. And God is at work everywhere, but very often we don't see him. And so I just wanted to draw out a couple other analogies from the Bible that I was thinking about. I was talking about Jonah. You know, it just so happened that when Jonah was running away from God, that he got to Joppa, and there was a ship that was headed for Tarshish, and there was enough room for him to get on there at the last second as he's running away. All of that was just coincidence, right? Just happened. Again, those seem like ordinary events in life of just Do you ever go through life and you try to figure out what is really God's will, and sometimes what's not God's will just seems to fall perfectly in place? And there's always these options and there's always these other directions that you can go in, and man, the details are just worked right out. We got to pay attention to these things to make sure that we're really, truly following God and not what we want to do. But make no mistake about it, no matter what decision you make either way, God's in those circumstances and he's governing and directing your steps and your life. I was Joseph being sold into slavery, thrown into prison. That's just really, really bad luck, wasn't it, in Joseph's life? Sometimes I was even thinking about Corrie ten Boom. I mentioned her a couple weeks ago in my message on Sunday about the fleas. That one just keeps sticking out in my mind. The fleas, right? The fleas were just really bad luck that they had these fleas. Remember, she said, praise God for the fleas, and Corrie told her sister, we're not praising God for the fleas. And then a few weeks later, they found out the reason why the soldiers or the guards would not come into their rooms was because of the fleas, which enabled them to be able to keep the Bible and to have God's word without it being discovered and without them being killed instantly on the spot. I mean, God's even in fleas and how he uses and orchestrates small, minute details of life like that. I believe with all my heart that's a huge lesson that Esther's trying to point out. See God in every single circumstance of life. And no matter how much we might make mistakes out of it, and no matter how much we may complicate it, realize that God's mercy is greater, and that no matter where we find ourselves, he's still moving and working behind the scenes, and he can still get glory, and he can still put the pieces of your life together. And so that's why I would just want to ask you, even personally speaking tonight, what about your financial problems? Just coincidence, right? Think God could be orchestrating and moving and trying to show you who he is through those things? What about your trials and your sicknesses and the different things that we face? What about relationship issues that are even in our lives? I mean, you have a bitter feud here between Mordecai and Haman. Have any of you ever found yourself in a bitter feud with other people in your life? Sometimes people that you have to work closely with, or sometimes family members. Could God be orchestrating and working some bigger things behind the scenes in those details of your life? Absolutely. God's in control of every single circumstance. And so I just want to close with a couple thoughts here about some hope and the hope that's in Esther. Let me just ask you that real quick. What kind of hope do you walk away with when you think about the book of Esther? Go ahead, Brother Powell. He's always in control. That's right. And he's faithful. Praise the Lord for that.
And it strengthens my faith knowing that God was working behind the scenes to further the Jews in that city, to try to push them forward and just moving forward towards the gospel, towards Christ. And just, it's just another story that just solidifies my faith in God and what he's done to bring himself on.
Yeah, by the way, never forget this. We're on the winning side. That's a powerful application. One of the analogies that I liked studying for this was Haman and Mordecai were they were pawns in a chess game that was taking place between God and Satan. And Haman makes his move, and that's almost like Satan saying to God, check, I got your people, and they're going to be wiped out, and I know that your seed was promised to come through them, and so I'm trying to prevent Jesus Christ from getting here. So Haman makes his move, and Satan says to God, check. And then God comes right in the scenes, and in that role reversal, turns it all upside down and says, yeah, right, checkmate to Satan right then and there. And Haman, Satan's tool and vessel, ends up getting hung on the gallows, and it turns around. We're on the winning side. Don't ever lose sight of that. Sometimes it can feel overwhelming, and our world can feel dark. And maybe we need to just watch a little bit less news as well sometimes, and spend a little bit more time encouraging ourselves in the Lord and praying for days like Love My Neighbor Day, and taking advantage of opportunities that we have to get the gospel into this world and into this community, because we are on the winning side, and God's moving and working. He's doing some huge things behind the scenes that we can't see. Just a couple things that I had written down, and it's on your notes for your handout. I think some hope in Esther obviously is my life matters. Your life matters. I think Esther 4:14 is a verse that applies to every one of our lives. Who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? We are alive in this world today for such a time as this, and God's got a specific plan, and he's got a specific purpose. He has something that he wants to accomplish through your life, and even if you've made mistakes, and even if you've complicated your life, and even if there's some moral ambiguity in your life, I promise you, he still has you where you're at for such a time as this, and he has something that he wants to accomplish through your life. So never underestimate that and never minimize that. Your life matters. Your life counts. I think of Esther in these two ways, and these are ways that all of us can be pictures of Christ. She was a picture of Christ by being willing to lay down her life for her people. If I perish, I perish. It's a picture of Christ right there. He did lay down his life for us, but I think we need to be willing to lay down our lives for what Christ has called us to, and that is to get the gospel to this world. That's why we're here, and I think we should be willing to do that. And I think the second thing is she was a picture of Christ by advocating to the king on behalf of her people. She went before the king begging and pleading for the salvation of her people. When was the last time we went before the king advocating on behalf of souls and people that we're burdened about? We challenge and encourage you to do that. That's really our goal for this year. That's going to be our goal, honestly, for every year. We should be constantly looking to see people saved and being intentional with the gospel everywhere that we go. And we need to be advocating before the king on behalf of souls and pleading and begging with God that he would spare them, that he would save them, that he would open up their eyes, that he would do something to draw them to Christ, that he would use us in a way to bring them to Christ. God has got a purpose for our life, and it's that simple. Let's just be dedicated to the souls and the people that are all around us. Go ahead, Joey. That's awesome. That's another great point right there. Esther was in that position because of her beauty. That's something that God gave her to be used for his glory. He's given us all different gifts and different abilities, and he's placed us exactly where he wants us to be. So that's good. I know sometimes I have that problem too. God's given me that gift of no, I'm just kidding. Killing me right there. All right. Anyway, the last thing I was going to say too, just to encourage you, a complete reversal is always right around the corner. A complete reversal is always right around the corner. Esther 9:1, I don't know if you have time to turn there or not, but it says in the middle of that verse, in the day that the enemies of the Jews, turn there, just if you want to underline this or highlight it if it's not, because this is a key verse in the Bible, and if you find yourself in the depths of despair and in darkness, just highlight this verse because it's powerful. In the day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to have power over them, though it was turned to the contrary, that the Jews had rule over them. A reversal is just always right around the corner, and we have to keep our faith in that. You know, we might end up dying even. You know, sometimes you might be in a trial, you might end up dying, but the second you die, you step into glory, into heaven with God forever. Yes, ma'am. Esther 9:1. It says right in the middle, it's a long verse in Esther chapter 9. And it's down towards the end. It's a really long verse. It says, in the day that the enemies of the Jews, so it's like 9b is really where that line is right there. In there. But I want to point out, I want to encourage you to never forget that, okay? It might seem dark and dreary. It might seem like Satan's just about to totally win out, no matter where you're at in life. But God's able to step in there, and he's able to take what Satan meant for evil, and he's able to turn that back around for good. And what I get most excited about is even our mistakes and our own faults and failures that we deserve to pay a price for. God's mercy is still great, and he gets so much glory through his forgiveness and through extending that mercy. And when we fall on our face and when we repent and when we cry out to God for forgiveness, he's able to now throw that right back in Satan's face and say, hey, I'm forgiving them and I'm loving them and I'm going to still use them for my glory. And that reversal just comes right in. You were in the depths of despair, placed there by your own sin. Satan's manipulating your life, but now all of a sudden God's getting glory from it. No matter what area you find yourself in, keep your faith and believe that a reversal is right around the corner. It might look like Satan's about to win, but he will not. We're on the winning side. To God be the glory. I love the book of Esther. That is some powerful stuff there. We could talk about it for hours on end, but our time is up. It is 8:04 and King